Finding the right workers was a key issue for Henry Ford. His first preference was for Michigan farm boys, reflecting his own cultural and uh, family roots. Uh, his second preference was for Southerners, whether white or black, and his third and last preference was for immigrants. Uh, he really disliked both Catholics and Jews. Uh, but by 1914, 70 to 75% of his workers were immigrants. The great majority of Detroiters were immigrants or either first or second generation at that time. So he had to adapt. Now, he's very famous for offering workers $5 a day in 1914. That was roughly double the average wage for workers. But that in itself can be misleading. Um, the what he was trying to address was an enormous quit rate. The In 1913, the quit rate was 370%. That meant that the number of workers who quit during that year was 3.7 times greater than the total size of his workforce. And this was costing him a lot of money because of all the expenses of hiring and processing and retraining workers who could who could stand the pace of his assembly line. Uh, his absentee rate was 10%, and worse than that on Mondays after a weekend. Um, Workers were simply not used to the drudgery, the regimentation, the physical demands. They were being asked to become machines, to do the same thing day after day, hour after hour, like clockwork. And this was simply beyond the limits of many workers to sustain. He had a backlog of 100,000 orders, cars that he could sell, but was not selling because he couldn't make them fast enough. And the $5 a day was a response to this set of circumstances. Uh, so with great fanfare, in January of 1914, the company announced that jobs would pay $5 a day. Part of this was called profit sharing. And this made the newspapers, and this was the crowd outside his Henry Ford or his Highland Park plant, waiting for jobs, trying to get a job um, at Ford's. Here's a newspaper story. It's even compared to the California Gold Rush. Uh, People were so anxious to get these jobs. But it had rules. Um, the 9 hour day was reduced to 8 hours, and then he could run around the clock. He could have 3 8 hour shifts in a 24-hour period. Um, Workers got wages of still $240 a day. That was just typical of unskilled work, but they got profit sharing that could reach $260 a day, raising the total to $5. But to get that extra 260, you had to fulfill certain requirements, and here's where the catches were. The requirements. First of all, you had to work at least 6 months with very good attendance. This was an attempt to address the absentee rate. Secondly, you had to satisfy the Ford Sociological Department that you were a worthy worker. Uh, and if you were foreign born, you needed to learn English and become a U.S. citizen. Now, let's talk more about that second point, the sociological department. He wanted workers who were married, preferably with kids, because this would give them a stake in their job. They couldn't walk away so easily when they had a family to support. Uh, so his social workers would visit the homes of workers unannounced. They would simply show up. At its high point, there were more than 100 people employed by Ford as social workers whose job it was to visit and often intrude on the lives of Ford workers. he wanted, stable workers, as I said, who had a stake in the job. Um, Now, these social workers would ask questions, and they would observe. And remember, they're showing up with no warning. Were the homes clean? Were the children clean? Was the father at home? Was there any evidence of drinking or smoking or gambling? Any, empty, beer bottles or, the smell of alcohol on the worker's breath? Ford was very paternalistic. He saw himself as a kind of father to his workers, but he was a stern father. Now, after these investigations, only 1/3 of Ford's workers actually got the full $5. So, this got a tremendous amount of publicity, but we need to understand this $5 day in context. The third requirement was to learn English. So he ran English schools. These are Ford workers at an English school. And when they graduated, when they learned English, the graduation ceremony was very telling. Notice the Latin phrase, a pluribus unum, out of many, one. And this was very much a process of Americanization. They had this device here is intended to represent a melting pot. So at the graduation ceremony, they would walk into this little enclosure wearing the clothing of their native countries. They would quickly change clothes, and when they walked out, they would be dressed as Americans, having made the transition to full membership in American society. That was the idea. Now, Highland Park, after only 7 years of production, was turning out to be too small for Ford's needs, so he began constructing the massive Rouge Plant in 1917, which is mostly still there and still operating. Today it produces F-150 trucks. Of course, in 1917, the United States entered World War I, and they began building Eagle boats. These were submarine chasers for the U.S. Navy. And there was absolutely enormous truck and tank and ship production for the war. Ford was not too keen on the United States entering the war, but once they did, he supported the war effort. Now, by 1929, there were 103,000 workers at the Rouge plant. But still, Highland Park was operating and had 18,000 working there. The Rouge was the largest single industrial plant in the world. It was a single-story plant, unlike Highland Park. No windows, no distractions, steel-framed. It was a completely self-contained environment. It was designed by the famous architect Albert Kahn, who designed a lot of factories, a lot of office buildings, became by far the best known architect in Detroit and one of the best known anywhere. This is a photo of the Ford Rouge. Ford was very much an example of vertical integration, where everything in the process he wanted to control. This freighter is owned by Ford. He used the Rouge River to transport things to and from the plant. He had a rubber plantation in Brazil and coal facilities and iron mines in northern Michigan, and the list is almost endless. These are Model Ts. He owned blast furnaces, a steel mill, foundry, stamping plant, iron mines, a fleet of ships, coal mines, a railroad, the tire plant, until he made a deal with Harvey Firestone to cooperate with him on tires. He had rubber plantations. He made his own glass. He bought entire forests in the Upper Peninsula. He had a lumbering plant at Kingsford. That's the source of what survives today as Kingsford charcoal. This was fully vertically integrated. Andrew Carnegie, I think, would have approved. Uh, in the 1920s, there were changes in the automobile industry. There was more installment buying. That means buying on time over making monthly payment. There was a greater selection of colors. Consumers began to demand that. More emphasis on style, on comfort, on status. Cars as status symbols. Um, and this was a time of prosperity in the 1920s, and these are responses to that prosperity. There was a movement actually called the Better Roads Movement, or the Good Roads Movement, um, and it allowed more design flexibility. The Model T was known for being able to handle any kind of rough roads. It was made for farmers' fields as much as anything else, but with roads improving, you didn't have to design. It gave you more flexibility in designing cars that didn't have to be able to handle so many rutted roads. Um, and during this period, uh, General Motors rose to prominence. It was led by Alfred P. Sloan, who was a genius who had a whole different business model than Henry Ford had. He introduced the annual model with changes in outward appearance every year, and this sort of thing would have appalled Henry Ford because it added to costs. But what it did was create status. I have a 1926 Chevrolet and not a 1924 or 25. Look at me. He set up a hierarchy of brands. You started with a Chevrolet, and then you'd move up to a Pontiac and a Buick and an Oldsmobile. And then when you had really arrived, maybe you could get a Cadillac. Um, this was selling social status every bit as much as it was selling transportation. Um, and so what he's doing is creating demand through obsolescence and status. If something is obsolete, it's out of date. If it's obsolescent, it's in the process of going out of date. The car might still run fine, but it didn't have the same social status, the standing that a newer model would have. The overall growth in auto sales in 1914, a little over 500,000. By 1929, it had increased ninefold to 5 million cars a year. In the later 20s, Model T sales started to decline. The peak was somewhere around 1923, and then it was a gradual decline. Chevy's sales rose. Um, the last Model T was made in 1927. Ford abruptly closed down the assembly line at the Rouge, and then, after a break, he introduced the Model A, and that turned out to be a big seller. He adapted to the market.